October 25th, 1415. In a muddy field near Agincourt in northern France, a young Henry V stands with 6,000 hungry, exhausted Englishmen facing somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 French troops. The English stand ankle-deep in mud behind rows of sharpened stakes, longbows in their hands, staring at a wall of steel and horses charging at them. If this day plays out the way it looks, the English will simply disappear. On paper, the French have everything. They have the numbers, heavy cavalry, and the richest nobles in the kingdom sitting in the front ranks in full plate. Many of them are so sure of victory that they argue over who will capture Henry V, not whether the English will break. By sunset, between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers and nobles will lie dead in the mud as the air above them turns black with arrows, while the English lose only a few hundred men. And a young king will walk off the field with his crown dented and his legend made. This is Agincourt, the day a half-starved army of archers and common soldiers shattered the pride of French chivalry. By the end of this story, you'll see how a weapon carried by peasants ripped through armor worth fortunes, how French nobles turned their own strength into a trap, and how Henry V turned a hopeless march into one of the most shocking victories in medieval history. So, why didn't this battle end the way everyone expected? Let's set the stage for this massacre on that muddy strip of French farmland. Back in 1337, Edward III of England put in his claim for the French crown. What started as a family argument over who should wear the crown turned into a long on-and-off war of raids, sieges, and big set-piece battles. Every so often, the two sides stopped raiding and lined up for a full-scale clash. At Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, those battles turned into a warning as English longbowmen cut down armoured knights and showed just how dangerous that weapon could be. By 1415, the Hundred Years' War had been dragging on for decades. England was weaker after years of quarrels at home and money problems. France was split by a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. When Henry V took the crown in 1413, he stepped straight into that mess. He was devout, hard, and trained for war, and he wanted to prove his right to rule and win glory abroad. So, he brought back England's old claim to the French throne, told France to recognize his rights and his lands, and when they refused, he chose to invade. This choice will drag him and his sick army all the way to that muddy field in Agincourt. In August 1415, Henry sailed from England with about 12,000 men, a mix of knights, men-at-arms, and thousands of longbowmen. They landed in Normandy and went straight for the port of Harfleur, putting it under siege. The siege dragged on. Dysentery tore through the crowded camp, killing hundreds and leaving thousands too weak to fight. And by the time Harfleur surrendered in late September, Henry's army was smaller and exhausted. Even so, he chose not to sail home, but to march that reduced force across hostile French territory to the English stronghold of Calais. From the start, that march was a gamble. French troops followed his army along the roads, gathering men to block his way, while the English, still sick and short of food, struggled through rivers, mud, and cold. By mid-October, a massive French army stood across Henry's path. On the night before the battle, the two armies faced each other across the fields near the village of Agincourt. In the French camp, there was singing, boasting, and easy talk of victory. Some nobles even sat with dice, joking about which of them would claim which English prisoners. Across the line, the English camp was quiet and tense. Men were worn down, and everyone knew the next day could finish them. Henry walked the rows, told them to brace for a hard fight, and reminded them why they were there. Around him, the archers sharpened their stakes and drove them into the soft ground to build a rough fence against enemy horsemen. At dawn, on October 25th, the two sides formed up. The English stood on a narrow strip of farmland squeezed between thick woods. Rain in the night had turned the ground to deep mud, and the narrow strip meant the heavier French force could not spread out or ride around the flanks. They would have to come straight ahead in armor into a narrow killing zone. Most of them still thought this was an advantage. It wasn't. Henry had about 6,000 men. Of those, roughly 5,000 were longbowmen. Their bows could send arrows out to about 250 yards and punch through the best armor of the day. The rest were knights, men-at-arms, and infantry holding the front line. Henry stayed with them in full plate armor, sword and shield in hand. He chose to fight in the line instead of sitting at the rear, and for men who were cold and afraid, that mattered. Across the field stood between 20,000 and 30,000 French troops, the pride of the kingdom. The front ranks were packed with armored knights and great lords, with men-at-arms, crossbowmen, and infantry in support. Banners flew, armor shone, and many of them were sure the English were already beaten. Behind that bright display, their leaders argued over commands and even over who would take Henry prisoner and claim his ransom. The nobles were determined that their knights would lead the attack and take the glory. That confidence would cost them. October 25th, 1415, the morning of the battle. As the light grew over the fields near Agincourt, the French mounted up, armor knocking softly in the cold air while their banners lifted in the breeze, showing the lilies of the Valois line and the signs of powerful families. On the English side, men checked bowstrings, set arrows within reach, and took their places behind the jagged line of stakes they had hammered into the ground during the night. Henry's order was simple: hold the line and let the enemy come. Between the two armies lay that narrow, soaked field Henry had chosen, hemmed in by trees and still heavy from the rain. It forced the French to bunch together and move straight ahead, and the wet ground pulled at anything heavy that tried to cross it. Henry knew his army could not stand there all day. They were short on food, and if the French decided to sit back and wait, hunger and sickness would finish the job without a fight. So, he took the initiative. He told his men to shift forward in good order, lift and reset their stakes closer to the French, and tighten the distance. It was a small step, but a loud one. A tired, smaller force was moving nearer by choice. That sight stung the French commanders. They chose to answer that challenge head-on and ordered their leading division to advance. The first ranks of armored men began to move, closing the gap at a slow walk as the mud grabbed at their feet and dragged at the hooves of the horses moving among them. The formation tried to stay neat, but the field worked against them. When they came far enough, the English archers finally went to work. Arrows rose in thick volleys, and the sound of bowstrings snapped over and over as thousands of shafts went out in waves. The missiles struck helmets and breastplates, slipped into weak points, punched into horses, and punched holes in the packed line. Men went down, animals stumbled, and the tight ranks began to ripple and sag. French crossbowmen could not return fire at the same speed because their weapons took longer to reload, while the English archers could lose 10 or 12 shots a minute each. With thousands of bowmen shooting together, that strip of ground in front of Henry's line turned into a constant storm of iron. Desperate to stop the archers tearing into their front, French officers sent cavalry to strike along the English sides. Riders urged their mounts forward, but the same sodden ground that slowed the vanguard dragged at the charge. Hooves sank deep, speed faded away, and when those horsemen reached the belt of stakes, the attack came apart. Some mounts crashed into the sharpened points, throwing their riders, and all the while fresh arrows drove into the confusion. English archers left their positions where they needed to, closing in with short weapons to deal with men and horses struggling in the mud. What should have been the blow that swept the English aside instead broke on the very field the French thought they were about to own. The French men-at-arms on foot moved up after the ruined charges, trying to keep the attack going. Packed into heavy plate, they had to force themselves over the same mud that had already swallowed horses. Each step dragged them down and slowed them. But there were so many bodies pushing from behind that the column kept inching forward. Arrows were still coming in. You could see helmets and breastplates with shafts sticking out at odd angles, yet more men pressed on, convinced that if they could just reach the English line, weight alone would break it. Eventually, that front edge of French infantry reached Henry's own men at arms. The fighting there was close and ugly. Blades hit metal, men swung axes at arm's length, and soldiers grappled and slipped as they tried to stay on their feet in the churned-up ground. Henry was there with them, not watching from a distance. He cut at opponents, shouted orders, and tried to keep his line steady under the impact. The English front bowed under the strain, but did not open up, and behind them the archers kept shooting into the crowded ranks, further back so the French could not bring their full numbers forward. As more and more men pushed into that tight space, the whole field started to resemble a single heaving mass of armor and bodies. What had been a glittering show that morning turned into men crammed together with no room to move their arms properly. Each fresh group arriving from the rear shoved the ones in front. Anyone who slipped or fell risked not getting up again because the people behind could not see them and simply pushed over them. The English soldiers in the front line could feel the weight pressing against their shields and armor. They dug in, took the impact, and struck wherever there was an opening. When the French came in so close that arrows were less use, many of the English archers shifted tactics. They set their bows aside, picked up hatchets, hammers, or knives, and worked along the edges of the melee. The French in the crush could hardly lift their feet, but the more lightly equipped archers could still thread through gaps. They went for eye slits and joints in the armor, dragging men off balance and down into the mud where they could be finished. Their own protection was thin compared with the steel coats of the nobles. But in that jammed space, being able to move and keep your footing mattered more than thick plate. In the center of it all, Henry V kept fighting. He wore a helmet with a crown fixed onto it, now scraped and stained by the chaos around him. At one point, the Duke of Alençon fought his way toward the king and landed such a heavy strike that it bent that crown. Henry pulled his household troops in close, struck back, and the French noble went down. Seeing their king still in the line, marked by the fighting but unshaken, gave the English a burst of energy, and from the crush of men came the shout of "St. George!" rising over the noise. On the French side, the mistakes made earlier in the day were now fully exposed. They had chosen to attack across ground that trapped them, under a sky filled with arrows, and their grand cavalry assaults had already failed. Now their armored infantry were packed so tightly that many could barely lift a weapon, and the leading ranks of the vanguard, worn out and hemmed in, were easy targets for English blows that came again and again. Behind that front, fresh French troops tried to join the fight, but they had to push over a field already strewn with fallen men and animals. Each new line stumbled, lost formation, and sank deeper into the mess before it ever reached Henry's soldiers. By the middle of the day, Agincourt looked like something out of a nightmare. Armor-clad bodies lay scattered across the mud. The cries of the injured mixed with the distant hiss of arrows and the constant clash of weapons. Thin streams of blood ran through the rutted ground, mixing with water and dirt. Even then, many French nobles kept trying to force their way forward, driven by pride, their sense of duty, and the simple refusal to accept defeat. The English, filthy, exhausted, and covered in mud, held their line and brought down every fresh group that managed to reach them. The moment when the whole battle would finally turn for good was getting closer with every minute. By mid-afternoon, the French attack was starting to fall to pieces. Their cavalry had failed, their infantry were bogged down, and the sheer size of their army was now working against them. The leading ranks lay tangled on the ground, along with dead and wounded horses, and the next line trying to move up had to step over bodies, stumble through muck up to their knees, and push into their own men. The old cry of Montjoie Saint-Denis still rose here and there, but it was drowned out more and more by St. George shouted from the English side. The forward drive stalled, and with that stall, the real chance of a French victory began to slip away. The layout of the field made things worse. The narrowing space forced their numbers into a tight lane where it was hard even to swing an arm. Tired horses dropped and pinned men underneath. Knights who went down often stayed there, trapped under the weight of armor and comrades pressing from behind. Henry's soldiers were close to the end of their strength, but they held a better position, standing a little higher up, with woods guarding their sides, while their archers kept firing whenever they had a clear target. The rain and mud that had punished them on the long march were now slowing the enemy instead. Just then, word reached Henry of a fresh danger. A French mounted group had hit the baggage area behind the English line, and at the same time, there was real fear that the many captured nobles might find weapons and join in from within. Henry was now fighting in front while knowing that a blow could also land at his back. To remove that risk, he gave an order that shocked many of his own men. The prisoners were to be put to death. Hundreds of captured knights, some among the wealthiest and most influential in France, were killed instead of being spared for ransom. Their offers of payment and mercy did not change what happened. A few English captains hesitated, but the command was carried out. In that moment, staying alive mattered more than the code of honor they had grown up hearing about. Out ahead, the last organized French force, the third major line, began to move. The men in it had watched most of the day's fighting. They had seen leading lords cut down or taken, and banners they had once followed lying in the dirt. The ground clutched at their legs, arrows still fell among them, and whatever fire they had at the start of the campaign was fading fast. When they finally closed with Henry's troops, they did not find a broken remnant. They ran into a line that had survived everything thrown at it. Many English archers by now were using blades, axes, or clubs rather than bows, and they went straight at the slowed French ranks. That last push from France collapsed almost as soon as it met the English front. From that point on, the field was no longer any kind of fair fight. The great French host, tens of thousands strong, had been cut down and scattered by a force only a fraction of its size. As the last groups trying to resist were surrounded or driven down, English soldiers, filthy and exhausted, raised their weapons and shouted in rough celebration. The flags marked with St. George's Cross moved in the damp autumn air over men who could hardly believe what they had just lived through. Henry V had taken an army that should have been swept away and turned the day into a crushing win. For France, the result was a blow unlike anything they had seen in living memory. Thousands of nobles were dead or in chains. Among the dead were major figures at the heart of the kingdom: Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, the Dukes of Alençon, Bar and Brabant, and many others whose names filled the rolls of the highborn. In a single battle, much of the senior leadership of French chivalry had been wiped out. For Henry, the outcome was not just a matter of captured standards or prisoners. To him and to many around him, it looked like clear proof that heaven had backed his claim. With a force that had been weakened by illness and short rations, facing a much larger enemy, he had still won by discipline, by choosing ground that favored him, and by the repeated blows of his archers. As the light faded, on October 25th, 1415, the area around Agincourt no longer looked like farmland. The soil had been torn up into deep ruts and hollows, with bodies and broken gear lying everywhere. A heavy smell of blood and decay hung in the cold air. English troops moved slowly among the fallen, making sure no enemy was still a threat and taking armor and weapons from those who would never rise again. All around them lay the spoils of the defeated nobility: swords with worked hilts, expensive plate harnesses, and fine surcoats bearing family emblems, all dulled and stained by mud. For the ordinary archers and men-at-arms, going back over that ground after the fighting was over meant picking through bodies and equipment, because that was how they stayed alive. When later generations tried to count the cost, the exact figures moved a little, but most agree that between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers and nobles died at Agincourt, while the English lost only a few hundred men. That kind of gap was hard to grasp. It was not a narrow win, it was a crushing blow that hit French pride and influence at the same time. And the people who fell were not just anonymous fighters. The roll of the dead reads like a list of the kingdom's leading families. Other key figures survived the day but not their freedom. The Duke of Orléans and the Count of Eu, for example, were taken and would spend years held in England. These were people who shaped policy as well as battles, and losing so many to death or captivity left France far weaker in the years that followed. For Henry V, the result changed how he was seen not only by his enemies but by his own subjects. He had crossed into France with an army hit by sickness and short supplies, and plenty of observers thought the whole plan was reckless. After Agincourt, he looked very different. He came away seen as a fighting king whose risk had paid off, someone many of his followers believed had been given help from above. Much later, Shakespeare would put the Band of Brothers speech into his mouth in the play Henry V. No one can prove that those exact lines were ever spoken on the actual day, but the idea of Henry as a man who could pull his soldiers together when it mattered stuck for centuries. On the French side, the damage ran deeper than the bodies taken off the field. For a long time, the image of a knight in full plate on a war horse had stood at the top of their social and military world. At Agincourt, that image cracked. Men of lower status, using bows and simple close-range weapons, had stopped them. Political life was already strained by the struggle between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and the loss or capture of so many nobles made that internal fight even more bitter. With fewer experienced leaders and more room for rivals to maneuver, it became harder to mount strong resistance to future English campaigns. The battle did not end the 100 Years' War. There were still many years of conflict ahead, but it changed the balance between the two crowns. England came out of Agincourt with new standing and bargaining power. Henry's claim to the French throne, which some had treated as wishful thinking, suddenly had to be taken seriously. France, by contrast, came away with its leadership thinned and its confidence shaken. Less than a decade later, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 would name Henry as heir to the French crown. a move that grew directly from the position he had gained, and the losses France had suffered in 1415. One of the clearest legacies of Agincourt lies with the longbow. It had been seen as a low-born weapon, something associated with commoners rather than lords. Earlier in the war, at places like Crécy and Poitiers, English archers had already shown what it could do, but there were still those who thought such results might be exceptions. After Agincourt, it was much harder to argue that. Wet ground, tight space, and disciplined archers working together turned that bow into a tool that could break the old pattern of battle. Knights in plate, who had dominated European warfare for generations, were shown to be vulnerable in ways many had not wanted to admit. Over time, although cavalry remained important, more and more of the real weight of war shifted toward infantry and later on, soldiers using gunpowder. In England, the memory of Agincourt settled into the national story. In France, the same day was remembered much more painfully. It stood as a warning about what can happen when overconfidence, internal division, and poor decisions meet on a battlefield. So, Agincourt was more than just a clash between two forces. It changed how people thought about fighting, altered the politics of two kingdoms, and showed what could happen when a determined leader and a disciplined army were pushed into a corner. For Henry, it marked the peak of his success. For France, it was a moment of deep loss and humiliation. For historians, it sits among those events that seem to sum up a whole period in a single day. People also keep returning to the broader lessons they see in it. People keep returning to the same lessons. Numbers alone do not guarantee victory. A smaller but well-organized army with clear leadership can beat a much larger one. Changes in weapons and tactics can overturn long-standing assumptions. Arrogance at the top can drag nations into disaster, and the choices made by commanders in a crisis can decide the fate of thousands. Because of all this, Agincourt still appears in books, lectures, and debates centuries later. It is often mentioned alongside battles like Thermopylae, Hastings, Waterloo, and Stalingrad as one of those turning points where the path of countries could easily have gone another way. For England, it remains a proud memory. For France, it is a scar that over time also pushed the kingdom to change and recover. For others looking back, it is a reminder that the biggest armies do not always decide history on their own. Human decisions, the resolve of ordinary fighters, and even the basic facts of ground and weather all play their part. Today, the land around Agincourt is quiet farmland again. Crops grow where men once stood in close ranks. Even so, the story continues to be told, of arrows rising in thick volleys, of armored men trapped in conditions they thought they could master, and of a king whose future rested not on comfortable odds, but on the refusal to turn back. When people speak about Agincourt's legacy now, they are talking not only about a famous victory, but also about endurance, leadership under strain, and the kind of resolve that can appear when everything seems set against you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, like the video and hit subscribe for more battles. I'll see you soon.